Gospel Topics Essays, Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints, Part 1. In this series, I will thoroughly examine the Gospel Topics essays published on the official LDS Church website. Each essay will be addressed in the order presented by the Church, offering a critical and in-depth analysis of the topics they cover. Since this topic essay is lengthy, I will be breaking it down into a two-part episode. Let's begin by examining the LDS Church's opening statement. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is founded on the teachings of Jesus Christ. The virtues of peace, love, and forgiveness are at the center of church doctrine and practice. Latter-day Saints believe the Savior's declaration, found in the New Testament and the Book of Mormon, that "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." In Latter-day Saint scripture, the Lord has commanded his followers to renounce war and proclaim peace. Latter-day Saints strive to follow the counsel of the Book of Mormon prophet King Benjamin, who taught that those who are converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ will not have a mind to injure one another, but to live peaceably. Despite these ideals, early Latter-day Saints did not obtain peace easily. They were persecuted, often violently, for their beliefs. And tragically, at some points in the 19th century, most notably in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, some church members participated in deplorable violence against people they perceived to be their enemies. This essay explores both violence committed against the Latter-day Saints and violence committed by them. While historical context can help shed light on these acts of violence, it does not excuse them. I will refrain from starting my commentary here and start with Part 1. Part 1. Religious persecution in the 1830s and 1840s. In the first 2 decades after the church was organized, Latter-day Saints were often the victims of violence. Soon after Joseph Smith organized the church in New York in 1830, he and other church members began settling in areas to the west, in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. Time and again, the saints tried to build their Zion community where they could worship God and live in peace, and repeatedly they saw their hopes dashed through forcible and violent removal. Mobs drove them from Jackson County, Missouri, in 1833, from the state of Missouri in 1839, after the governor of the state issued an order in late October 1838 that the Mormons be expelled from the state or exterminated, and from their city of Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1846. Following their expulsion from Nauvoo, Latter-day Saints made the difficult trek across the Great Plains to Utah. All right, let's cut through the fluff and get straight to it. The church starts with the initial statement, but then doubles back, digging into some of the deeper issues. So I'll be jumping back and forth as needed, tackling each point as it reappears. Let's start by ripping apart that first claim. The church shamelessly claims that mobs drove them from Jackson County, Missouri, in 1833. But that is a blatant distortion of reality. The truth? The Mormons provoked the locals to the breaking point. In June 1832, W. W. Phelps, a zealous Mormon convert and former New York editor, arrived in Independence, Missouri, to establish a printing press. Wasting no time, he launched the Evening and the Morning Star, a propaganda machine that stoked tensions with incendiary rhetoric. Independence resident Josiah Gregg bluntly described the escalating situation. In proportion as the Mormons grew strong in numbers, they also became more exacting and bold in their pretensions. In a little paper printed at Independence under their immediate auspices, everything was said that could provoke hostility between saints and their worldly neighbors, until at last they became so emboldened by impunity as openly to boast of their determination to be the sole proprietors of the land of Zion. This wasn't just a case of religious persecution. The Mormons openly declared their intent to take over. The July 1833 issue of the Evening and the Morning Star only poured fuel on the fire. One article, while pretending to advocate for legal land purchases, drew a dangerous comparison to ancient Israel's conquest of Canaan. It warned Mormons that while Israel had to obtain the Holy Land by the sword, Jackson County was to be taken through legal means. But the very mention of bloodshed, no matter how it was framed, sent a clear message to the Missourians. This was a takeover, and it was only a matter of time before the Mormons justified violence to achieve it. The Mormons didn't come to independence looking for peaceful coexistence. They came to seize control, carve out their theocratic empire, and push out anyone who stood in their way. The locals saw the writing on the wall, and they weren't about to sit back and let it happen. The church boldly proclaims, from the state of Missouri in 1839, after the governor of the state issued an order in late October 1838 that the Mormons be expelled from the state or exterminated. But what they conveniently leave out is the fact that the LDS Church itself ignited the Missouri Mormon War of 1838. Under Joseph Smith's watch, Samson Avard formed the Danites, a violent paramilitary group that carried out acts of aggression against anyone who stood in the church's way. And what was the spark that lit this war? Sidney Rigdon's infamous Salt Sermon in June 1838. Rigdon wasn't just preaching a sermon, he was declaring war. Under the guise of purifying the church, he targeted dissenters and outsiders, sending a clear message: opposition to Mormon leadership would not be tolerated. Rigdon twisted Matthew 5:13, branding dissenters as the salt that had lost its savor, proclaiming they must be cast out and trodden underfoot. This was no harmless biblical metaphor. It was a thinly veiled death threat. Historian D. Michael Quinn observed that Rigdon's rhetoric created a combustible atmosphere in Far West, where loyalty became synonymous with survival. In other words, fall in line or face the consequences. The church doesn't want you to know that they escalated hostilities, provoked their neighbors, and set the stage for the extermination order. But we're going to expose the real story behind the Missouri Mormon War, and it's not what the church wants you to believe. The church tries to play coy, claiming, and from their city of Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1846, following their expulsion from Nauvoo. But let's cut through the nonsense. The Mormons weren't expelled from Nauvoo, they abandoned it. After Joseph Smith was gunned down in Carthage jail, Brigham Young seized control and took the church in an even more militant direction. Tensions escalated fast, and violence broke out between Mormon settlers and anti-Mormon vigilantes. Both sides engaged in arson, intimidation, and forced removals, escalating an already volatile situation. But here's what the church won't tell you. Brigham Young and his leadership made the call to leave. They weren't driven out at gunpoint. They chose to pack up and head west. Of course, not all Mormons had the luxury of following. Many stayed behind due to poverty, illness, or sheer reluctance to uproot their lives. And that's when the real fight for Nauvoo began. In September 1846, anti-Mormon militias, the so-called Hancock County Regulators, launched an assault on the city in what became known as the Battle of Nauvoo. After a brief siege, the remaining Mormons were forced to surrender and flee under brutal conditions. And let's be clear, the Illinois government never ordered their removal. Their Nauvoo city charter had already been revoked in 1845, stripping them of legal protections, and the state simply looked the other way as tensions exploded. The Mormons weren't expelled in some grand act of persecution. Their leadership abandoned them, leaving those too poor or weak to flee at the mercy of their enemies. The church then moves on with, as Latter-day Saints faced these difficulties, they sought to live by revelations to Joseph Smith that counseled them to live their religion in peace with their neighbors. Nevertheless, their adversaries in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois resented the saints' differing religious beliefs and social and economic practices. They also felt threatened by the saints' growing numbers, which meant that Mormons could increasingly control local elections. These opponents attacked the saints, first verbally and then physically. Church leaders, including Joseph Smith, were tarred and feathered, beaten, and unjustly imprisoned. Other members of the church were also the victims of violent crimes. In the most infamous incident, at least 17 men and boys, ranging in age from 9 to 78, were slaughtered in the Hawn's Mill massacre. Some Latter-day Saint women were raped or otherwise sexually assaulted during the Missouri persecutions. Vigilantes and mobs destroyed homes and stole property. Many of the saints' opponents enriched themselves with land and property that was not justly theirs. Let's get one thing straight. The locals of Ohio and Missouri never stood a chance. The moment the Mormons moved in, they wasted no time asserting their dominance. They didn't just settle. They declared that they were there to claim land for their so-called Zion under Joseph Smith's rule. One massive, blatant lie the church peddles is that the Mormons were driven out of Ohio by outsiders. That's complete garbage. There were two major reasons for their departure, and neither had anything to do with persecution. Smith's own followers were turning on him. Even his own leadership had had enough of his corruption, deception, and failed prophecies. The Kirtland Church was collapsing from within. Smith and Rigdon were running from their own financial crimes. They had set up the Kirtland Safety Society, an illegal, unregulated bank that crashed spectacularly, taking members' life savings with it. When the courts came calling, Smith and Rigdon didn't stick around to face the consequences. They fled town like cowards in the dead of night, leaving their followers to deal with the financial disaster they created. They weren't forced out. They ran. The Mormon weren't peaceful settlers looking to integrate in Missouri. They were invaders with a theocratic agenda. They forced their beliefs onto established communities that were already rightfully suspicious of them. And why wouldn't they be? The Mormons made it clear that they weren't there to coexist. They were there to take over. This wasn't a misunderstanding or religious intolerance. This was the Mormons shoving their hands into a hornet's nest and acting shocked when they got stung. For once, the church is actually telling the truth when they admit they also felt threatened by the saints' growing numbers, which meant that Mormons could increasingly control local elections. These opponents attacked the saints, first verbally and then physically. Damn right they felt threatened. And why wouldn't they? The LDS bloc voted exactly how their leaders told them to. There was no individual choice. If the prophet or church officials backed a candidate, the Mormon vote was locked in. This wasn't democracy, it was theocratic manipulation. Joseph Smith knew the power he wielded and wasn't shy about using it. He cut backroom deals with local politicians, promising a flood of guaranteed Mormon votes in exchange for favors and influence. So can you really blame the locals for seeing this for what it was? This wasn't religious persecution. It was an entire population being politically hijacked by an authoritarian religious regime. The LDS Church misfires spectacularly, with yet another string of cherry-picked half-truths. In the most infamous incident, at least 17 men and boys, ranging in age from 9 to 78, were slaughtered in the Hawn's Mill massacre. Some Latter-day Saint women were raped or otherwise sexually assaulted during the Missouri persecutions. Vigilantes and mobs destroyed homes and stole property. Here's what they conveniently leave out. Hawn's Mill was not some random act of unprovoked violence. It was a retaliation. Just days earlier, the Mormon Danites had attacked at Crooked River, burning people out of their homes and murdering non-Mormons. The Danites started this war, and Missouri's militias responded in kind. Both sides committed atrocities, yet the church pretends they were the only victims. They sweep the Danites' brutal assaults under the rug while parading Hawn's Mill as a one-sided massacre. How convenient. We then get the following from the church. After being driven from Missouri, the saints were initially welcomed by the people of the neighboring state of Illinois and found peace for a time in Nauvoo. Ultimately, however, conflict arose again as non-Mormons and dissenters from the church renewed their attacks. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were brutally martyred by a mob in an Illinois prison, despite the promise of the state's governor that the brothers would be protected while in custody. 18 months later, beginning in the cold winter month of February 1846, the main body of the saints left Nauvoo under tremendous pressure. They settled in temporary camps, what would now be called refugee camps, on the plains of Iowa and Nebraska. An estimated 1 in 12 saints died in these camps during the first year. Some of the elderly and poor initially remained in Nauvoo and hoped to join the main body of saints later. But a mob forcibly expelled them from Nauvoo in September 1846 and then desecrated the temple. One non-Mormon who passed through the saints' camps shortly thereafter wrote, "Cowed and cramped by cold and sunburn, alternating as each weary day and night dragged on, they were, almost all of them, the crippled victims of disease. They could not satisfy the feeble cravings of their sick. They had not bread to quiet the fractious hunger cries of their children. The scope of this violence against a religious group was unprecedented in the history of the United States. Hold it right there. The church claims, ultimately, however, conflict arose again as non-Mormons and dissenters from the church renewed their attacks. What an absolute distortion of reality. What they conveniently fail to mention is that two of these so-called attacks were actually legal attempts by Missouri officers to arrest Joseph Smith and Porter Rockwell, both wanted in connection with the attempted assassination of Governor Lilburn Boggs. Instead of facing the charges, Smith abused his Nauvoo charter powers to shield himself from justice. And let's talk about the real catalyst for Smith's downfall, one the church desperately wants to erase from history. Joseph Smith committed a blatant crime when he ordered the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor Press. The Expositor, founded by William Law and other former high-ranking Mormons, exposed Smith's secret plural marriages, including his attempt to marry William Law's own wife, Jane Law. Smith, ever the power-hungry despot, couldn't handle the truth coming out. His solution? Destroy the press. He had the printing press smashed, the building burned to the ground, and in doing so, he trampled on the First Amendment and violated freedom of the press. That's why Smith was arrested. Not because of persecution, but because he broke the law. And yet, even after all of this, the church tries to paint Joseph and Hiram as brave martyrs. Wrong. They ran and hid like fugitives, only surrendering when their own followers begged them to. The only reason they turned themselves in was because the Illinois governor promised their safety. Spoiler alert, that didn't go as planned. Once again, the church peddles its revisionist sob story, omitting critical facts and overhyping the drama. They claim Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were brutally martyred by a mob in an Illinois prison, despite the promise of the state's governor that the brothers would be protected while in custody. Let's tear this apart. First, the Smith brothers were not brutally murdered. That's an emotionally charged fabrication. If we can even trust the church's own dubious account, Hiram was shot a few times and died almost instantly. Joseph, on the other hand, was shot and then jumped out a second-story window, ultimately falling to his death. Why did he go to the window when he knew men were outside waiting? Was he trying to escape? Did he realize the fight was over? Either way, his own actions sealed his fate. Now let's talk about what the church doesn't want you to know. Joseph and Hiram were not helpless prisoners behind iron bars. In reality, they were granted an absurd amount of privilege. They had visitors coming and going freely, and that's how they managed to smuggle multiple pistols into their room. That's right, the Smiths were armed. Unlike the sanitized martyrdom story the church sells, Joseph and Hiram fired at their so-called attackers, wounding at least 3 men. So ask yourself, why does the church deliberately erase this part of the story? Could it be that their martyrs were actually armed men engaging in a shootout, not innocent victims? Hold on just a minute. The church claims, 18 months later, beginning in the cold winter month of February 1846, the main body of the saints left Nauvoo under tremendous pressure. But earlier in this same essay, they insisted the saints were expelled from Nauvoo. So which is it? Did they choose to leave, or were they forcibly removed? Because only one version of events can be historically accurate. Here's the truth. Brigham Young and the top church leaders abandoned Nauvoo before the bulk of the membership, racing ahead to secure their own futures while leaving their followers behind to suffer. This wasn't about noble persecution, it was about self-preservation. And let's not sugarcoat this. Young's reckless, premature flight in the dead of winter created untold suffering for his own people. The brutal cold, starvation, and disease that followed, that wasn't caused by mobs. It was the direct result of the Mormon leadership's cowardice and mismanagement. But rather than own up to their failures, Young and the church spun the story, blaming everyone else and rewriting history to make themselves look like victims. Look, what the Mormon pioneers endured was remarkable. Their survival, their endurance, that was a testament to their resilience. But let's be absolutely clear. It wasn't persecution that forced them westward. It was their own leaders' cowardice, arrogance, and failure to plan. The church makes charged statement when they claim, church leaders and members repeatedly attempted to gain redress from local and state governments. When these petitions failed, They appealed unsuccessfully to the federal government to correct past wrongs and gain future protection. Latter-day Saints long remembered the persecutions they experienced and the unwillingness of government authorities either to protect them or to prosecute their attackers. They often lamented that they experienced religious persecution in a land that promised religious freedom. In the face of this extended persecution, some of the saints, beginning in 1838, responded on some occasions with defensive, and at times retaliatory, actions of their own. I'd say the church is once again misleading, but I will call a spade, and they are outright lying. While there was no widespread compensation immediately after the Mormons were expelled from Missouri, their legal claims for restitution were actively pursued, though these claims were denied time and time again. The truth is, the church's narrative distorts this reality. In 1976, Missouri Governor Christopher S. Bond rescinded the extermination order, calling it a blot on the history of the state. But let's be clear, this wasn't some act of redemption. The federal government did offer limited assistance in 1839 to help the Mormons relocate to Illinois, but the Mormon leadership's continued demands for federal intervention were met with resistance and disdain. Furthermore, while the Mormons sought federal intervention, they also faced significant internal leadership struggles and moral contradictions that led some factions to act outside the law. For example, Joseph Smith's actions, particularly his involvement in the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor, contributed to the eventual tensions with both the Illinois government and the broader public, undermining the idea of Mormons purely as victims of external oppression. In the late 19th century, Mormons relentlessly pursued legal action to seek compensation, but their efforts were met with little more than empty promises. While the U.S. government issued resolutions acknowledging the injustices they faced, it wasn't until 1890, decades after the fact, that the Mormons finally received any legal recognition or settlement for the damages they claimed. This delayed response paints a clear picture. The system wasn't exactly in a hurry to right any so-called wrongs done to them. Here's a real question. Why didn't the LDS Church have to pay back for the destruction they caused? They were directly involved in wrecking lives and property on the other side, yet somehow they managed to avoid facing any real accountability. It's one of the many inconsistencies in their self-serving narrative. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.